We are approaching the end of the text titled Sri Aurobindo Upanishad, and in the first half, going up to the first 8 verses, it was a vision of the divine in all his aspects, emphasizing his underlying unity, identifying the world with him, it is himself as world, and highlighting the reality of the world, which is as real as the reality that shines out to become the world. All is real. And this was the emphasis of the first half. And then the pivotal verse 10, whatever thus manifests is the world bliss only. And from this point on, the second half of the Upanishad dwells on this blissfulness of the world and our participation in this bliss. The world itself, he says, is born out of bliss, is made out of bliss, and bliss is the very stuff of things. The divine himself, as the all-blissful, chooses to enter the world to enjoy his own bliss. But for the purpose of the completeness of the play, he disguises himself. The all-blissful divine disguises himself, concealing his bliss, and conceals also in the process the bliss of things. And therefore, he experiences the appearance of non-bliss. But this appearance of suffering, of limitation, of incapacity, is still an experience made of bliss, because after all, the all blissful can only enjoy his own all bliss. But in the appearance, it is as if there is a concealment, a deformation, or a play of the bliss. And this is the message which is emphasized through a series of images that describe how only the one who is all blissful can dare to enjoy blisslessness. Only the one who is all powerful can dare to enjoy weakness, or only the omniscient can dare to play with ignorance without losing himself. And then the focus shifts now to the individual soul. The all-blissful has taken his poise as the jiva in order to enjoy his bliss. And this jiva blissfully laughs, blissfully cries and sheds tears, as if enjoying a dark ananda. For the purpose of this enjoyment of what appears as a dark ananda, he conceals the ananda and himself conceals his own bliss. And this concealment now creates as if a curtain, a separation of the jiva within and the experience of enjoyment and the phenomenon on the surface, where the individual appearance is now of the ego, incapable, bound in ignorance, weak, helpless, and now suffering. And the result of this finiteness, of this limitation, is a whole chain, a series of experiences that take place, which he describes as the very form of ignorance in mind. So ignorance, this concealment, this layer of the veil that blocks out the bliss of the true enjoyer, the jiva, this ignorance is the root of this idea that I am but finite and therefore incapable, weak and sorrowful. From there the chain follows, I have to act, to know, to achieve with labor, with expenditure of energy, and therefore incurring mortality. Then the difference between I and you are that, I am this. What you are not, that I am. What is good for you is bad for me. All these differences of the play of the ego are highlighted. And then, as we grow through this play, we rise to a larger understanding, going beyond my little I to a larger collective I. And now, for the collective experience, for the collective growth, I have to sacrifice my individual need. But I am not so sattvic and so happy that to make you happy I will suffer or I will lose for you. And there is a struggle that the ego has while it widens itself into a larger, widened ego sense. But that is still an ego in relation to something still wider. And so there is this struggle, ityadi, and so on. The ego struggles to grow. But this pattern of behavior is the form of ignorance in mind. And the seed of this ignorance is indeed ego. And so in verse 16, which we read last time, by deliverance from ego, one is delivered from ignorance. By deliverance from ignorance, one is delivered from suffering. And the whole journey is leading us to a widening, a growing, a maturing, until eventually this curtain which separates the jiva from the ego is gradually removed. And one is delivered from ego, one is delivered from ignorance, one is delivered from suffering. There is the blissful experience of the jiva that now permeates the whole. Knowing that I am all blissful, he am I am one, I am infinite, I am all. One becomes all blissful, one becomes a being of bliss. So we dwelt on these steps last time, which are so close to the pattern of the integral yoga. There is at first the recovery of oneself as the all blissful. And this experience is natural to the emergence of the psychic being and the identification with the psychic being. And yet, there is a step further. From that psychic realization, one has to realize also, he am I, the recovery of the self. And the oneness of the self in which the world and self are one. And the infinity and completeness of the self in manifestation, where I am infinite, I am all. Infinite in consciousness, all in multiplicity. And thus, one becomes all blissful and a being of bliss. Both the nature and the consciousness now participate in this bliss. This was verse 16. And now we come to verse 17. In the translation in English, which is not so accurate in many places, but still we will follow this first. This indeed is liberation. Liberated, he enjoys the enjoyments of all. Enjoying all joys infinitely, he is not separated from finites. Enjoying finites, he is not deprived of the infinite. He is one, he becomes many. He is indeed unborn and is, as it were, born. Even being born, he is not born, is not bound. He has no birth. I, the self, reveal self, by self, in self. Liberated by this knowledge, one enjoys the play. So from this point on, from verse 17 and two more verses, the whole description moves to this liberated being participating in the divine bliss. In verse 16, the ego was delivered, ignorance was removed, suffering was abolished, and the all blissful emerged. But the all blissful, recovering his totality, recovering his completeness, now what does he do? He is liberated. What is he like and what does he do is the description of these three verses. So, verse 17, which we are now reading, describes what he experiences. And then verse 18 and 19 will describe what he does. So, verse 17 starts by saying, "This indeed is liberation." And we will refer now to the Sanskrit text. Esha eva moksha. We observed last time, he says, this alone is liberation. And we saw last time that the other definitions of liberation are incomplete. Exclusive withdrawal into oneness is not true liberation. It is a binding into oneness. Exclusive dissolution into the unborn is not liberation. It is a partial experience of the Brahman. The true liberation knows the oneness and the multiplicity, knows the unborn and the birth. So this alone is liberation, is the literal translation of the Sanskrit. Esha eva moksha. And as if to elucidate the rest of the verses, remind us of what it means to be liberated. So, samukta sarveshan bhogan bhunkte. Literally translated, it would be, the liberated one enjoys the enjoyments of all. And here is a very interesting suggestion. Not only this state of liberation means that we enjoy all things, but it means also that we participate in the enjoyment of all beings. Because now this liberated state is not just I, but I who am all. The enjoyments of all are my enjoyments. So all these experiences which are being had in so many other beings are still my experiences. It is I who enjoy through them. And yet there is this person who enjoys. So in the nature of the experience, there is a double status. There is a uniqueness of the jiva who is enjoying, and he is enjoying uniquely, different from all other jivas. And yet he includes their enjoyments from his perspective. In his thoughts and aphorisms, Sri Aurobindo has this image where he describes this completeness of the enjoyment. If honey could taste itself, and each drop taste the sweetness of all other drops, and the sweetness of the entire hive. It is, and I paraphrase, thus would be the relationship of the self, the world, and God in this liberated state. So if honey could taste itself, one is aware of one's own bliss and one enjoys one's bliss, except that it is not just I, the separate one, it is I, the all. And there is a uniqueness to this enjoyment of my bliss, even as the all. And then taste the sweetness of all other drops, because they are also part of this my enjoyment. But now I experience also their uniqueness, their unique perspective, which are mine or facets of mine. And then there is a third, the entire beehive. That is God. The experience of the oneness of the all. That also is the bliss. And they are as if three simultaneous experiences of enjoyment, although they are one enjoyment. So, in the Sanskrit, literally, sabhunktaha, the liberated one who is enjoying. So, that enjoyer would be the literal translation. Sarveshan, of all, bhogan, the enjoyments of all, bhunkte, he enjoys. So, the Liberated enjoyer enjoys the enjoyments of all. But remember also, we remind ourselves in the Sanskrit, bhunktaha is not only the enjoyer, also the enjoyment is a nourishment. So he who draws nourishment, who enjoys the nourishment of this play, of this bliss, that is the sense. And the journey of the divine, as he thus enjoys his own bliss, is also therefore a journey of growth. He grows by this enjoyment of his bliss through all the experiences of the world. And that's why we have this famous line from Savitri, God shall grow up while the wise men talk and sleep. There is the growth of the divine. Although he is complete, although he has no need, although he is the all, and yet there is this unfolding movement of growth in space and time, for which purpose all this was manifested. So Sabhunkta, he is the enjoyer, thus liberated, but he is also drawing nourishment as he enjoys. And when he enjoys the enjoyments of all others, he is also drawing nourishment from it all. It is as if in his completeness of identity with the universe, he grows in each experience of everything that happens in the universe. Then, next. Sarvan anandan anantam bhunjano na santair viyujyate. Enjoying all joys infinitely, he is not separated from the finites. We might think that in the process of enjoying the all, he is so full of the whole universe that he is overwhelmed by the all and perhaps could not enjoy the little small things. One of the common refusals of the ego to the spiritual life is in saying that I want to enjoy these little things. I don't want to give up these little things for some grand, wonderful, infinite joy of the divine. We think that in the recovery of the oneness, all this beauty of multiplicity would get blurred and would get lost. The finites would dissolve into some kind of a uniformity of infinity, because the mind knows finites in opposition to infinity. But the supermind, as the creative power, is at the same time infinite always, and yet projects finite fronts which are not cut off from their infinity. And yet they are finite. It is that which creates the finites. So in the true experience of this complete liberation, not the one-sided liberation, although the jiva enjoys all joys infinitely, he is not separated from finites. That is, he can enjoy equally the finitenesses and the finite forms of the infinite joys. So as this liberated being reaches out to hold a flower in his hand, he experiences himself reaching out to touch the infinite, appearing in the front of a finite flower. He experiences the finiteness of the front and enjoys the uniqueness of the flower, but does not lose the sense of the underlying infinite. As he breathes the perfume of this flower, he experiences the uniqueness and finiteness of the appearance of that perfume, but through that perfume experiences the whole universe behind, revealing itself uniquely in that one unique perfume which has never been before, which will never be hereafter in the unfolding time, and yet was always, is always, will be always in the infinity of things. So there is this double experience in which the infinite is the underlying reality always. But he is not separated from the finites. The wording is very important here. There is not this cutting off from the finites, which are also there, but the finites are seen as a special expression of the infinite. On the other hand, he now plays with the opposite side. Enjoying finites, he is not deprived of the infinite. We will translate it slightly differently in the Sanskrit. Santani bhunjano na anantena hiyate. Hiyate, the word is reduced. Not just deprived, reduced. So by enjoying the finites, he is not reduced from the infinite. It is not that by enjoying finites I get lost in the finiteness and therefore my consciousness collapses back to finiteness and the infinite fades away or is lost. That is not the case. He is not reduced from the infinite even though he enjoys the finite. So this is the double status where the focus is on the finite. This being now liberated, if he is truly liberated, we can't say that he cannot enjoy finiteness. Then where is the liberation? He is able equally to enter the finite fully, even as if putting up a front of exclusiveness. I and the flower are alone immersed in this experience. There is no other. Such can be the immersion in the flower experience. But at the same time, he is not cut off. When the ego consciousness takes the flower and say, my flower, he is cut off from the whole. But this liberated being can take the flower and say, my flower, knowing all the time behind the infinity and the oneness, including all things. He is not reduced by the enjoyment of the finite. You will remember the mother often made a reference to this, that she had to reduce the focus, she had to bring the focus of her consciousness to a certain front to be able to participate in the play with the human beings around her. And she said, there I know, here I withhold the knowledge. And this withholding is not ignorance, it is a deliberate withholding. And we have drawn this analogy often. When an adult plays a game with a child, he withholds his strength. If you play chess with a child who is beginning, then you will not demonstrate the brilliance of your intelligence, you will withhold your intelligence and play like a child, knowing full well and yet being able to enjoy the play with the child, enjoying even the experience of losing in order to encourage the child, and yet you will enjoy that focus of the finite, limited knowledge or strength that you put out. So it is something similar. There is a withholding and a status is created on the front consciously, as if one does not know, as if one cannot, as if one is separate, and so on. But it is never a real ignorance. It is only a play, an appearance. So, enjoying finites, he is not reduced from the infinite. He is not deprived of the infinite. So this, remember, when we started with this alone is liberation, he's showing you both sides. That in the true liberation you have both experiences of the finite and the infinite, and they are not cut off. In the description of the supramental time sense, Sri Aurobindo discusses 4 statuses of the supramental consciousness. At the highest, there is this timelessness. There is no sense of being bound in any unfolding time. You are entirely free of time. At the next level, which is simultaneous and a projection of the first, you see this massive extension of time, past, present, future, in a single sweep, and all possibilities of past, all possibilities of present, all possibilities of future before you simultaneously. There is no movement of time, there is only the spread, expanse of all things in time. And then there is a third status, which is a further projection of this, and simultaneously with this, where you see the giant cyclic movements of time unfolding as a movement. That which is unmoving, simultaneously present, now takes on a form of movement, and so naturally it must be rhythmic and cyclic, and yet there is a movement unfolding where past, present and future are seen in an unfolding process, and yet all possibilities of past, present and future are held in the unfolding movement. And then a fourth status where the consciousness projects as if into one point of focus, into the present or the past or the future, but into the focus of a moment and a series of moments which seem to be as if separate. And yet the moment is nothing but a narrowing of the focus of the same large rhythms of the unfolding, which is nothing but a narrowing of the focus of the totality of time which is spread out, which is itself nothing but a narrowing of a timelessness underlying. And at the same time, all four statuses exist. There is only a particularization of the consciousness in its focus of attention. But it is always free in the timeless. It always sees the whole trikala, the three times of past, present, future in their continuity, seeing their rhythms and dominant themes and movements and intentions, while still participating in the moment as it unfolds in time. Which predominates? It is the free choice, because they are all simultaneous, not separate from each other. But the supramental being may choose to concentrate all its attention as if on the most superficial part of this fourfold experience, and be as if an ordinary human being, play as if with the ordinary limited experience of time and of fate and of surprise, while at the same time behind he always holds the complete freedom. So this is the true liberation. So liberated, he enjoys the enjoyments of all. Enjoying all joys infinitely, he is not separated from the finites. Enjoying finites, he is not reduced from the infinite. And the next is the play of one and many. He's at the same time one, he's at the same time many. And there is the play of both, not separated. So, sa eko bhavati, bahur bhavati. He becomes one, he becomes many. The translation is not accurate. The translation says he is one, he becomes many. But the way Sri Aurobindo has said it in Sanskrit, he becomes one, he becomes many, suggesting that in his consciousness he is both. He is one, he is many, he transcends one and many. All that was shown to us in the beginning of the Upanishad. But now, in the play, he can choose to shift his poise, to emphasize his oneness, to emphasize his multiplicity, or even to hold both poises at the same time. So he becomes one, he becomes many. And remember, oneness and multiplicity was one axis, the other axis was birth and non-birth. Both are elaborated in the Isha Upanishad across several verses, you will recall. And here Sri Aurobindo encapsulates all that into just a couple of phrases. So the next one explores the relationship of birth and non-birth. Sahi ajo jayata iva. He is truly unborn, and yet as if born. And then from the other side, jayamanopi, although as if born, na jayate, is not born. Na badhyate, is not bound. So, although he is unborn, he is as if born. Although appearing to be born, he he is never born, never bound. This would be the literal translation. So the English translator here has put it thus: he is indeed unborn and is as it were born. Even being born, he is not born, is not bound. The key word here is not bound. He is bound neither to birth nor to non-birth, and yet there is a relationship. The non-birth is the underlying reality. After all, he is free. And yet the birth is an experience that he can choose freely and can involve himself fully in it, never being bound to it though. And na badhyate, he is not bound. Na janma tasya vidyate. He is translated as he has no birth. No birth. Vidyate. In Sanskrit, the vidyate has a very specific sense. Vidya is knowledge. So, no birth, he knows, would be the literal translation. When you say he has no birth, that's not correct. He does not know birth would be the literal sense. And the idea is that when the one chooses to take birth, he never loses his poise of freedom from being unborn. He can experience birth, but he never enters the knowledge of exclusiveness in the birth. So, na janma tasya vidyate. We can also feel in this a suggestion that is given that from the human side, when we look at such a being, although we see him born in human form, we see in him that unborn presence which is behind. We do not see him as an ordinary human. We see him as an immortal who has entered the domain of birth. So, na janma tasya vidyate has this double suggestion. From his side, he is never bound, that was emphasized earlier. But from our side, we also feel his immortality, that unborn poise of his self behind the appearance of birth. When Panditji's elder sister had her first darshan of Sri Aurobindo, she was so overwhelmed, and when we asked her to describe, she said, he was so large, he was so wide, and Panditji himself remembered it as, he was like the Himalayas. That's the only thing you can compare. And yet on the front you see a form, and you could measure the size of the body. But the person is not this front, the person is that massive, unborn, timeless, spaceless one who puts on this front of time, space, form for the play. Na janma tasya vidyate. To our knowledge, we do not see, we do not know the normal birth in this experience. And then the next is a very beautiful description of what he experiences in himself. I read the English translation first. I, the self, reveal self by self in self. Liberated by this knowledge, one enjoys the play. So in the Sanskrit, there are certain nuances. He is, after all, in this state of liberation, he is always self. But self who knows his oneness, self which is also multiplicity, self which is unborn, self which is born, and self which is infinite and finite at the same time. So our idea of self must be corrected. When we think of self, we think always of self static. But Sri Aurobindo emphasizes there is the static self and the dynamic self, but self is the totality including both. So when we have been through all this description where the two sides of the experience have been brought together, he describes what it is in summary. I, the self, I am always self. Whether from this poise or that poise, or both, I am always self. Reveal self, and that is the whole movement of manifestation, of unfolding of myself. By what means? God created the world, we say, out of what? What material did He have to take? Well, out of self. By self alone, this self is revealed. Where is this taking place, this revelation? There is no other, there is only self. So the whole thing takes place in self. So I, the self, reveal myself by self in self. And this is the liberating knowledge. In the Sanskrit, the sequence is slightly different, and we will explore that a little. Atmani Atma Atmana Prakashayam Atman. Prakashaya Atmanam iti. Atmani Atman Atmana Prakashayam Atmanam iti. So, in the self, Atmani, the self, Atma, by self, am radiating self. Prakashaya. You remember this word Prakashaya was used in the first half when he described the world being born out of the One, and it was always used in the image of a radiating light, radiating of consciousness, where the self is consciousness and the radiation is also consciousness, the world unfolding by radiation of his own light, his own awareness, his own consciousness, expanding to become. By power of consciousness, he reveals himself. So we are again going back to that idea, the self radiating out his own awareness. So, in the self by itself am radiating self. By this knowing, okay, so the rest of the sentence, iti jnanat vimukta kridate. Thus, by that knowledge, jnanat, vimukta, liberated, kridate, plays. So by this knowing, liberated, he plays. The literal translation would be by this knowing. In the English translation, as the other translator has done here, liberated by this knowledge, has a sense that if I know this, then I am liberated. And the sense is more of an intellectual knowledge. But if you take the literal jnanat, by knowing this, there is an identification of the experience with the knowledge. And this is important in all of these descriptions. It is not something we understand. It is not something that we perceive. It is something we become. We are in the experience. So his experience is this knowing. What does he know? In the self, I the self, by myself, am radiating self. By this knowing, liberated. So this is the nature of the liberated experience. All is self taking place in self, revealing self. But in this liberation, he plays. And the whole purpose of this radiation of one's self is for the purpose of the play. Kridate. Playing. Krida is the play. In the root sound, it is still the same root as action, to do. So the sense of play acts out the play, moves into action for purpose of play. The English word play does not carry this sense. Play is an abstract idea. But in the Sanskrit root, it is action moving into play. Kridate. So this is verse 17, and we can reread this before we move to verse 18. This indeed is liberation. The liberated one enjoys the enjoyments of all. Enjoying all joys infinitely, he is not separated from finites. Enjoying finites, he is not reduced from infinity. He becomes one, he becomes many. Although unborn, he is as it were born. Although appearing to be born, he is not born, not bound. He has no birth. In the self by self, am radiating self. By this knowing liberated, he plays out his action. And verse 18 now picks up from here. If each one of us is thus in a liberated play of action, what would that be like? That's the direction in which we are meant to grow. So, verse 18 goes thus: For Leela, the play, the divine play, for Leela indeed is the world. That is, the world was created for Leela. He has become playful for joy. Therefore be engaged in Leela, O sons of bliss. Being united, play. Enjoy the bliss. Having attained the one enjoyable divine, enjoy him in all things. The translator has had to break up a longer sentence in Sanskrit into many short pieces, but it captures all the elements of what is being said. First, that the world was created for the purpose of this play, for the enjoyment of the divine bliss, for Leela. And he became playful for the joy of his bliss. Therefore, we are intended to participate in that bliss. We are intended to engage in this play, Leela, and we are ourselves children of that bliss. And so, being united with him, with his blissfulness, we are exhorted to play and enjoy the bliss. But what does it mean to enjoy his bliss? Is it that the human experience that says, my flower I will enjoy in its exclusiveness? Is that the enjoyment? So he gives us the clue. Having attained the one enjoyable divine, enjoy him in all things. That we are meant to enjoy his presence, his oneness, him who is all in each experience. And that is the secret. And you will find in this straight away, the first verse of the Isha Upanishad is resonating behind, although formulated in a completely different way. You will remember the first verse of the Isha, Isha Vasyam Idam Sarvam. All this is for the habitation of the Lord. And Sri Aurobindo explains, the habitation is for what purpose? Why does the Lord need to inhabit? Habitation, he says, is always for possession and enjoyment. So the Isha Upanishad does not highlight the aspect of enjoyment. It is implied in the purpose of the world for his habitation. Here Sri Aurobindo reverses the priority, brings that purpose first. For enjoyment, this world is created. But you will see it is the same idea, more obviously stated from the perspective of bliss. Isha Vasyamidam Sarvam. Yat kincha jagatyam jagat. In the tiniest world within world, that is each tiny piece of experience, the flower I take, is the whole universe putting the front as a flower. And within each tiniest detail, it is the one who is to be enjoyed. It is the one who is present. And this idea comes in being united play. Having attained the one enjoyable divine, enjoy him in all things. This is implied in this. But in the Isha, the rule of the divine life is given. Tena tyaktena bhunjita ma gridha kasya svidhanam. By that renounced, thou must enjoy. Seek not after another's. So, by that renounced, the rule of the divine enjoyment is that you must renounce ego and desire, and therefore you must enjoy, or you must allow the divine to enjoy through you, and what is enjoyed is itself the divine. But all this is implied in the rule of the divine life. Here Sri Aurobindo puts this in front, and the rule of the divine life is implied. Having attained the one enjoyable divine, enjoy him in all things. And obviously, one must have given up the ego and desire, etc., which was already part of the previous description. So you see, there's a very deep connection between the message of the Isha Upanishad and this text which has been called Sri Aurobindo Upanishad. The close similarities, but the starting point is different. And here the focus is much more direct, of the experience of the divine having emerged and the play being the obvious purpose. So we look at the Sanskrit text. Leelartham hi jagadanandartham leelamaya iti leelam kuruta anandasya putraha. So Leelartham, for the purpose of the Leela, for the play, he, only for that purpose. Jagad Ananda Artham, for the purpose of the divine, of the world bliss. Leela Maya, the one who is all blissful. Thus, Leelam Kuruta, thus plays out his play. Kuruta, actions out, works out his Leela, play. Now, Leela, I had touched upon this earlier once. The word, if you go back to its root sounds, it's a play of L, but Li and La. In a very interesting text, which is not so well appreciated, Sri Aurobindo looks at the root vibration of each sound. And he takes K, G, P, M, A, I, U. All of these, he gives you the sense, the psychological sense of each of these sounds. And there, L is the sense of contact, the touch, the meeting of two. E has the sense of relativity. A has the sense of absolute. And if we then try to feel what the direction this sound leads to, Li and La, it is the contact in the relativities and with the absolute. And if you dwell on this, meditate on this, you can see already in it the play through contact, through touch of the many coming together in relativity with the underlying base of the absolute that holds it all together. And Leela is therefore carrying with it the sense of the play of contact, of many, of multiplicity. Play, when you look at it this way, if you reduce all play to its essential character, you will see all play is a reaching out of relationships, of contacts of various kinds, which are varied continuously. Nothing is left constant, otherwise there is no play. The play involves a continuous change of various kinds of relationship or contact. And yet, it is not a divine play unless it is in security. You cannot play when you have fear. You can go into the battlefield and you don't call it play, unless you know you will survive, come what may. If you are fully armored, then you can enter the battlefield without fear. So there has to be this underlying security of the absolute that holds this infinite possibility of relative plays of relationship. And all this is captured in the single word, Leela, when you look at the root sounds. So, for Leela, for the world bliss, the one who is all blissful thus worked out his Leela, his divine play. For Ananda, for the bliss, Anandasya Putra, O children of bliss. Yukta, united, bound, and it's not clear what it is that you have to be united with or joined with. Kridata anandam bhunktvam ekam bhogyam. So as children of the bliss, united, and the suggestion we can dwell on, meditate on the various possibilities because it is not specified. United with the Lord, the One, united with His will, His play, His bliss, united with each other in an underlying oneness. All of these could be suggested. The underlying unity having emerged, the play becomes secure, and then it is truly a blissful play. So as children of bliss, and you will see the contrast. In the Veda, we are described as children of immortality. Sri Aurobindo emphasizes the blissfulness of the immortality. Mother had a very interesting observation. She says in the Veda, and subsequently at each time that a special manifestation took place, a certain aspect of the divine was emphasized. In the Veda, it was the immortality of Satchidananda. Shankara highlighted the permanence, or the Buddha highlighted the permanence. Sri Aurobindo highlights perfection. And then Mother says, ultimately they all come to the same thing. But they're just different facets which are highlighted. So you will see throughout in Sri Aurobindo's writings, everything is to be taken to its perfection, and the perfection is all-inclusive. Here, it is the idea that we are children of that, but not the aspect of immortality emphasized, but the bliss of that. Why do you seek the immortality? Immortality, remember, Amritam is the domain of Satchidananda. Do you seek it for its permanence of Sat? Do you seek it for the consciousness or the power of consciousness? Or do you seek it for its bliss? And in a sense, one can say the whole universe was born out of bliss, and therefore the purpose of our play and our seeking is that aspect of bliss. And therefore we are children of bliss more than anything else. Amritam of the Satchidananda is implied. It is the blissfulness which is the purpose. So, Anandasya Putra, Yukta, united, or with the unity emerging, Kridatan, Anandam Bhunktva, Ekam Bhogyam Bhagavantam Prapya, by attaining to the one thing worth enjoying. Ekam Bhogyam. And what is that? Bhagavantam, the divine, Bhagavan. And again in the translation we lose the sense of it. Divine does not carry the same sense as Bhagavan. You will recall we dwelt on it. Bhagavan is the one who is the enjoyer. So the one thing worth enjoying is the divine enjoyer himself. And by attaining that, enjoy and participate in the play of bliss. Having attained that one enjoyable divine, enjoy the bliss. But then he ends with, by attaining this one enjoyer, Bhungdvam Sarva Vastushu, in all things, in all forms, in all objects, enjoy him who is the only one who is worthy of enjoyment and who is himself the enjoyer, divine. So there's a very interesting play, a multifaceted experience of enjoyment. Who enjoys? The divine. He enjoys himself in the object that you seek to enjoy. He also enjoys himself through you, who is the enjoyer of that object you want to enjoy. The enjoyment itself in between the object and I is his enjoyment. So you have to attain to the one thing which is worth enjoying, and that is the enjoyer himself, who enjoys himself in each object and through you, and whose enjoyment we share. So in the formulation, there is an important suggestion. To be able to truly enjoy the world bliss, you should not lose yourself in seeking the enjoyment of this object or that object, but you should seek directly the one thing worth enjoying. And when you gain Him, you discover that He is the one who is enjoying in all things, and you automatically participate in the enjoyment of all things. So again, this logic is implied in the first verse of the Isha, but here it is made explicit and the base of the whole practice. You will remember also in the formulation of the integral yoga, in the yoga of self-perfection, there is the famous summary of the whole yoga in 4 steps that Aurobindo places in this aphorism: Shuddhi, Mukti, Siddhi, Bhukti. Purification, liberation, realization, beatitude. That is how he translates it. So this is the 4-step sequence. As increasingly we purify ourselves, remember that's the removal of the veil that separates us from the true person within. As there is an increasing purification, there is an increasing liberation. The liberation leads to the realization, and it must be a complete, integral realization. And as a result of the integral realization, there is the beatitude of the play and participation of the divine bliss. And it is this which is highlighted in verse 18. And you see the same sequence across the last 4 verses. And we can reread verse 17 and 18 and meditate on it for a while. Knowing that I am all blissful, He am I am one, I am infinite, I am all, one becomes all blissful, one becomes a being of bliss. This alone is liberation. The liberated one enjoys the enjoyments of all. Enjoying all joys infinitely, he is not separated from finites. Enjoying finites, he is not reduced from infinity. He becomes one, he becomes many. Although unborn, he is as it were born. Even appearing to take birth, he is not born, not bound. He has no birth. In the self, by self, am radiating self. By this knowing liberated, he plays. For Leela indeed is the world. He has become playful for joy. Therefore be engaged in Leela, O sons of bliss. Being united, play, enjoy the bliss, the world bliss. Having attained the one enjoyable divine, enjoy Him in all things.